Hello and welcome. My name is Michael Rapoport. I'm a senior reporter with Bloomberg Tax Accounting. And I'm here today with Martin Kreienbaum, the Director General of International Taxation in Germany's Finance Ministry. Martin is also the former chair of the Committee on Fiscal Affairs at the OECD. Martin, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today. So the first thing I wanted to ask you about is the EU's agreement last week on implementation of Pillar 2, the global minimum tax that's part of the global tax agreement. As you know, that this has been debated and kind of in suspension for many months, and finally, both Hungary and Poland, both of which have voiced opposition at different times, are on board. Can you talk a little bit about how the EU finally got to yes, and you finally got both Hungary and Poland on board?
Yeah, you find me in a very happy mood today because the European member states, all 26 member states, have actually managed to get the directive adopted after weeks and months of discussions earlier this year. And I think this is a major milestone that all 26 member states, comprising of more than 450 million people, population of more than 450 million, and GDP of more than 13 trillion euros. I think this is a huge success that we have achieved last week. And the French presidency also already in the first semester of this year had tried hard to get the directive adopted. And I think the adoption of the directive last week really shows the clear and strong commitment of all member states of the European Union to put an end to a race to the bottom when it comes to corporate taxation. And when we discussed this in summer and in fall, I think everybody was aware that we discussed issues that were not really related to the minimum taxation directive. So it were more related issues unrelated to the directive that have made two member states blocking the directive for a couple of months. And finally, I think everybody agreed, and it really shows the commitment of all member states to do something in the area, in the space of corporate taxation. And I do consider this as an enormous step that we have made last week in Europe.
So what happens now? What's the timeline? What challenges still remain? What things still need to be done? And do you expect all EU members to get this done and implemented in relatively short order by the end of 2023?
That's true. The directive requires all European member states to implement the minimum taxation rules based on the directive by the end of 2023, so that the rules can be applied as of the beginning of 24. And that, of course, puts us a bit under time pressure again in terms of domestic legislation. And we in Germany, we are starting this process pretty soon. We basically have already started this process in preparing draft legislation, which I think will be published earlier next year. So we envisage to publish the first draft in the first quarter of 2023. So that would give us enough time also for consultation with domestic business here in Germany. I think that's also important because we all know that the rules are quite complex, although we have tried hard to simplify the rules. That's also pretty clear. But we need to be in a constant discussion, in a constant exchange of views with all stakeholders, including business. And that also requires a quite early publication of the first draft, so that everybody, in particular taxpayers, are aware what's coming in terms of concrete rules, so that they can prepare for the rules for 2024. So we are starting this process early next year.
Now, as you know, people are very much awaiting the remaining guidance that you expect to issue on aspects of Pillar 2. What can you share with us about exactly what still remains to be issued and when it's going to be coming.
So the whole inclusive framework, the steering group in particular, and also the OECD Secretariat for the CTPA, the Center for Tax Policy and Administration, we all have worked very, very hard over the year on the so-called administration package, which is a package that is supposed to ensure a consistent administration, a consistent cross-border administration of the rules, and that includes guidance on the so-called country-by-country safe harbor for a transitional period of time, which is important because given the complexity of the rules, we need to make sure that all taxpayers can also follow the rules in time. And we have always said that we look at simplification, that we look at transitional rules that facilitate the first years of the application of the rules. So the safe harbors play a big role. And within the safe harbor discussion, the country-by-country safe harbor plays a big role. Then we have a discussion on so-called non-material, non-consolidated entities. And here we are also looking for simplification, for simplified calculation methods. That's also quite an important piece of our work.
Okay. As you know, the situation in the United States with regard to implementing Pillar 2 is still very unsettled. The U.S. passed its own corporate alternative minimum tax, but that's not consistent with Pillar 2. The U.S. Treasury has acknowledged that at the end of the day, there are going to be some differences between the two. How would you characterize the OECD's and Europe's position in terms of how accommodating or not accommodating they're going to be in terms of accepting the corporate alternative minimum tax as a Pillar 2 regime?
Yeah, we are in constructive discussions when it comes to the interaction of the Pillar 2 rules and the US rules on the corporate minimum tax. And I think it is important that we clarify all areas where we need to interact, where the two regimes, the two sets of rules need to interact. And I would characterize those discussions as being very constructive from both sides, from the US side constructive and from the side of the other countries also constructive. What is important in the end is a level playing field. I think that is something what we need to make sure that taxpayers, corporations can operate on a playing field that is leveled. So I think that is also recognized by all stakeholders, and also I think by the US that this is an important point, that we need to make sure that the level playing field is there and that corporations, taxpayers do not suffer competitive disadvantages when they invest in Europe versus or in areas outside the US versus the US. I think that is the larger challenge, to make that sure that we keep the playing field leveled.
At the end of the day, though, as you know, the corporate alternative minimum, U.S. corporate alternative minimum tax is not a country-by-country regime. It's a blended regime, and that, at least in the past, has proven to be something that the EU and the OECD are not going to accept as a regime that conforms with the global minimum tax. Has there been any change in that respect, or do you still maintain that a minimum tax has to be country by country in order to align with Pillar 2?
The OECD and Inclusive Framework agreed rules, the so-called model rules, they are based on a jurisdictional blending, which of course differs from a global, from a worldwide blending. And when it comes to the interaction of US GILTI and the Pillar 2 rules based on the jurisdictional blending, we need to make sure here again that the playing field is leveled. And that means that we need to breakdown, to push down the worldwide blending to a comparable jurisdiction-wide blending. And this is still under discussion, how we make sure that the level playing field is there in this area. I think the idea is really to have a comparable situation. I think it's also clear that the two approaches, worldwide blending and jurisdiction-wide blending, they cannot exist side by side. They need to be somehow integrated in a way that makes it sure that the playing field is leveled.
Do you think that at the end of the day, that the corporate alternative minimum tax and the global minimum tax are dissimilar enough that some companies will in fact be double taxed? We'll have to pay both taxes.
I think one of the overarching ideas of the whole work that we are undertaking in the inclusive framework is to agree on a coordinated interaction of rules on Pillar 1 and on Pillar 2 as well. And we have always promised to business that the large benefit, the big benefit of our work is that, first of all, business would get tax certainty, would know what the tax is that they have to pay. But we have also said that one of the big advantages is the avoidance of double or multiple taxation. And I would also see the interaction of US GILTI, the US corporate alternative minimum tax, and the Pillar 2 rules in that respect. I would also say that we need also to make sure that there is no double counting, no double taxation. But in the end, we need to find a good agreement on the interaction that makes that sure. I cannot promise that we always arrive at a full avoidance of double taxation when it comes to the interaction of different rules, but I think that is at least the objective under which we are discussing this.
Let's turn now to Pillar 1, the reallocation of profits under the global tax agreement. What do you see as the biggest factors weighing on countries in that respect, and what are the biggest obstacles to getting to final implementation of Pillar 1?
First, I would like to say that we have made good progress on many of the essential building blocks of Pillar 1. And we are all aware that we need to have a clear set of rules, that everybody knows how Pillar 1 operates, and we have still a number of areas where we continue discussions, where we are in continuing discussions on the rules. That applies, for example, to the marketing and distribution safe harbor, but also other areas where we are still discussing. And again, we have made good progress. It's also clear that we need a critical mass of countries that implement Pillar 1 once agreed on the basis of a multilateral instrument, but that we need a certain number of countries and jurisdictions that has implemented Pillar 1, because otherwise Pillar 1 will not work. You need a certain number, you need a critical mass for the administration of Pillar 1. I think that is one very important point. And you also need a critical mass for the avoidance of double taxation, because I think that everybody is aware that you cannot allocate taxing rights to countries, to participating countries, and to countries that have already implemented, when you not have at the same time agreement with countries that suffer the burden of avoiding the double taxation. And that must be very clear. We need the critical mass, and that means that we first need to get consensus on the remaining issues which are still under discussion. Here we have made good progress, and I'm very, very confident that we will also solve the remaining issues quite soon. And then we need to prepare the legal instrument, the multilateral instrument, which is planned to be open for signature next year in summer. And then we will see how many countries will sign and implement then Pillar 1 according to their domestic rules and in their domestic set of rules. And then from there, we will then see from when the rules can apply.
You talk about getting to a critical mass of countries adopting Pillar 1, and as you know, the United States' adoption is particularly important in that respect because so many of the companies in scope under Pillar 1 are U.S. companies. But as you also know, any multilateral convention implementing Pillar 1 is going to require ratification by 2/3 of the U.S. Senate. And that, given the current political situation in the United States, promises to be extremely difficult at best. Given that, how do you view the likelihood of the U.S. Following through and ratifying the multilateral convention and implementing Pillar 1?
Yeah, the United States is not the only country in the inclusive framework that has an independent parliament. And like in all other countries, parliaments need to be convinced of the advantages that the agreement under Pillar 1 offers. The situation here in Germany is the same, in other countries as well. It's the same or similar situation. And I do think that we can offer a lot with our agreement on Pillar 1. We can offer certainty and stability of the international tax architecture. And this is one of the really big advantages, and which is also really new, that we can offer that we can offer agreement among 137 member states of the inclusive framework. And this could guarantee stability. And it's always the question of the alternative scenario. So I do think that the arguments that speak for an adoption and implementation also by the US, the arguments are overwhelming, because taxpayers and US corporations in particular, we all need that assurance that we want to avoid double taxation, that we want to avoid unilateral measures. And we have seen this discussion here in Europe in previous years, this pressing discussions, this discussion around unilateral domestic digital service taxes, not harmonized, not consistent with an international framework, which by nature would always lead to multiple taxation of the same profit. Because the justification also for the digital service taxes, although they were connected to transactions and based on transactions, the justification for the taxation was a profit taxation. You would not expect other countries to recognize that profit taxation when it comes to the avoidance of double taxation. So other countries would not eliminate that profit from domestic taxation, that profit that is subject to DSTs in other countries. So in order to avoid those unilateral measures, in order to avoid double and multiple taxation, also seeing the chance for a broad international agreement, which could also serve an example for future ideas of international taxation. I think that is a value as such, and that should also, I do hope at least, convince the Parliament, Congress in the US. And again, we are all in the same situation. I also need to convince, we also need to convince in other countries, we also need to convince our parliaments of the advantages, and I think the advantages are there.
Let's talk a little about a Germany-specific issue, the Section 49 withholding tax on intellectual property. For anyone who's watching who isn't familiar with this measure, can you give a brief overview of exactly what it is and what's happened with it up till now and what its current status is?
Yeah, Germany has a taxing right in place that is there, that has been there for many, many years, since 1927. So not all taxpayers were always aware of that taxing rights, and some of them became aware in recent years. And this taxing right is connected to intellectual property rights registered in German registries. And based on this based on this registration in German registries, Germany would apply a withholding tax on those rights when they are being sold to other parties. We are in discussions. We have been in discussions with a number of other countries on this taxing rights. We have tried to facilitate the administration of this taxing rights because many taxpayers came very, very late with their tax declarations to us. And we also started a legislative initiative here. The legislator has decided to get rid of some of those taxing rights with respect to third-party license agreements. And this law has passed our parliament quite recently. With respect to related party license agreements, we continue to make use of these taxing rights. We are in discussions with our administrations. The state tax administrations in particular are dealing with those cases. For the future, we envisage to tax only to make use of this taxing right only in cases in which there is no double taxation agreement. And this has already also passed our parliament.
One last question. Now that both Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 are not quite nearing completion because there's still a lot to do, but the end is kind of in sight. Does the OECD have any plans in terms of what it plans to focus on next and tackle next in terms of global taxes?
Oh, I think there are always many things to do, and the strong focus on Pillar 1 and on Pillar 2, I think was necessary and still is necessary, but may also have distracted member states from looking at the usual business. And I think mobility of workers is one of the bigger issue that we also need to discuss at the OECD's level and maybe in the inclusive framework, because we have not only seen during COVID times that this has become a more important issue for many taxpayers in particular that work from home office, cross-border situations. I think that occurs more frequently here in Europe because countries are much smaller compared to the US. But we are dealing a lot with those cases with all of our neighbor countries. We also recognize that there is a growing need also beside the COVID pandemic to address those issues because the digital area simply, the digital age simply makes it possible more and more, and it gets more and more normal to work from home offices, that we need to get clear guidance on those questions. And we do think that we need consistent internationally agreed consistent rules on those questions and coordinated rules on those questions. So this is certainly one of the areas where we can expect more work in coming years.
Thank you. We've been speaking with Martin Kreienbaum. Martin, thank you so much for being with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.